Hi guys, today I'm going to show you how to make a starter. This is my version of how to do a starter, which is pretty simple to how most people do it. First, I'm going to take a clean bowl. I'm going to set my scale back to 0. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to take flour, which is, I'm just using 50 grams. You can use any amount, but just keeping in mind that the more flour that you actually use, the more you have to feed it, and then it just becomes too much. So it's 50 grams of flour, and then I'm going to mix in my 50 grams of water. It's equal quantities to start off with. So once you've got your equal quantities of flour and water, you're just going to mix them together. It does go quite thick, but don't worry too much about that, because later on you'll see once it's fermented a little bit, it will actually thin out. Okay, and that is all there is to it. Once you've got it all mixed together, you can take your container that you're going to put it in. I like to use a clear container so that I can mark the side to see whether or not my starter is growing. You can also use a glass container. So once I've got it into my container, try and get out all of your starter, especially once it starts fermenting, because you don't want to lose all the good stuff. So I'm going to just get it all in there. Just going to give it a little bit of a push down just so that we can get it to go as flat as possible. You don't want it to sit up on the sides of your bowl. Okay, if it does sit up on the sides, you'll see it'll go pretty hard and it'll become quite difficult to wash. Okay, then all I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of plastic. This is just a little packet that I've cut, and I'm just going to stick it on with an elastic. This is just to protect it from anything getting inside, because obviously you're working with something that's going to be fermenting, and by it fermenting you're going to attract things like little fruit flies. Okay, now on your starter, if you are doing this for the first time, it is advisable that maybe you write the date on your starter. This is just to help you to remember when you created it. Okay, but if you have done this before and you're not too worried about dates, then you don't have to put anything on. What I will advise though is that you just go down with the marker and you mark the side of your container. This will help you see whether or not your starter is actually growing. Okay, so I've just marked it. I've given it a little bit higher than what it actually is, because once the starter settles and sinks, you'll notice that it will rise obviously a little bit, but this starter is fresh, so there is no way it's going to rise in the next 24 hours. So we are just doing a marking there just to see what it does. So now that you've got your starter like that, you're going to leave it for 48 hours. You're not going to be stirring it. You're not going to be adding anything to it. You just leave it for 48 hours. The other thing that is advisable is if you take some sort of a sharp object and you just prick one little hole in the top. That's just to let some air get into your starter, but it's not big enough to let any fruit flies get in. Okay, so that is the start of our starter, and I will see you back in 48 hours. Right, 48 hours later, and your starter has probably grown a little bit. Mine has grown. You can also tell that mine grew quite high and then it dropped. All right, this is because it needs a feeding. You can see inside there. I hope that you can. There's quite a few bubbles in there, which just means that it's pretty active at this point. Right, so now we're going to be doing our first feed. If yours has got water in yours, mine doesn't seem to have any, but sometimes it can develop what we call hooch, and that is just because your starter needs to be fed at this point. Okay, so for our first feed, we're going to just give it a good mix. Remember when we first made it, it was quite thick. You can see that now it is pretty runny. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure out 50 grams. If you have more than 50 grams, you can feed the whole lot, but you end up with quite a bit of starter if you do that. So I'm just going to, just in the time that I'm trying to get my starter to be nice and active, I'm just going to keep it at 50 grams all the time. Okay, almost there. Okay, that should be good enough. We've got 50 grams. Now what I'm going to do So I'm setting my scale back to 0. And I'm going to now feed it 30 grams of flour. And I'm going to feed it 20 grams of water. Okay. So now, okay, it should be 50, but obviously my water is slightly out, which is not serious. But now what you've done is you've added more more flour to your starter. That way you eliminate sort of getting hooch, okay? So now all you're going to do is you're going to give it a good mix like you did before. And then once it's all mixed up, you're going to place it back in your container. Now, you're not going to place it back in with the leftover starter that is in there. You're going to go and clean the container out and then put it into a nice fresh container. Okay, so you can see that our starter's gone nice and thick again. It's not runny like it was. Okay, it's fairly clumpy. So now I'm going to just go and feed my container. I don't want that leftover starter. I'm going to just clean it out and then place it back in here. Right, with my clean container, I'm going to just place my starter into it. I'm going to try and get it to fall into the container, into the center, so that I don't necessarily get starter going up the sides. Okay, if it goes up the sides, then it becomes quite hard to get off. So when you have to wash it next time, it's a little bit more tricky. Okay, I'm just going to give it a little bit of a shake, just so that it can go down a little bit. You'll see that because it's still a little bit thick, it'll end up, once it starts settling in, you'll see that it will look like it's risen a bit, but that's only because it's settled in. So same as before, I'm just going to mark it a little bit higher than what it is. Okay, so I've now marked it, I've got my covering on it, and now I'll leave for 24 hours, okay? You will notice that within the next sort of 2 to 3 hours, your starter should have started growing already. It should rise a little bit. If your starter hasn't risen and you've got really cold weather, that would obviously slow the growth down of your starter, so don't worry too much. But generally speaking, you should be able to see a rise in the next couple of hours. Okay, and then I will see you back here in the next 24 hours for our next feed. Hey guys, we're back with our next 24 hours. You'll notice that mine has risen quite a bit. It's very close to doubling in its size. Let's take this off, and then you'll be able to see I've also got quite a few bubbles in there. I'm not too sure if you can see too well, but there are quite a few bubbles in there. You'll see that there are quite a few bubbles in here, and it's gone quite runny again. It's got quite a sour smell as well, which it's supposed to have, so we are on the right track. So now we're just going to feed it again. We're pretty much going to be doing this feeding process from now until it is ready to work with, but you can see how runny it actually is. So I'm just going to give it a little bit of a mix, and then same as before, I'm going to measure out 50 grams. We only want the 50 grams. Okay, so we got our 50 grams. You'll see that there is still a little bit left. Okay, we don't necessarily need that. All right, then what we're going to do is, as before, we're going to add, I'm going to do 20 grams of water. It was almost 20. When I weighed it out, it was. And then I'm just going to add my flour. It's also out a little bit, but it's not serious. Okay, so now I've basically added 20 grams of water and 30 grams of flour. When I weighed it out the first time, it was all correct. So obviously just moving tables and that, it has changed it, but it is correct. And I'm just going to give it a nice mix. You'll notice that it firms up again. Okay, just going to mix it together. So it's just doing the same thing over and over and over again, getting all that flour in. Right, you can already see it's gone quite thick again. It's not as runny as what it was, which is perfect. The smell, even though it is sour, it's not a bad sour smell. which is perfect because you don't want it to be a bad sour smell. Sometimes what happens is the starter it almost smells like nail polish remover, which generally means that your starter is probably quite hungry, so you haven't fed it enough flour. I find feeding it just kind of taking 10 grams off of the water and adding it to the flour, I do find that is better. Obviously, if I use bigger quantities, that'll change. But for now, we're going to stick to what we've got. Okay, so I'm going to go and wash this container out, and then we're going to place it in this container, and then in a couple of hours' time, we'll see that it has started rising. Okay, so I'm back with my container. It's clean. I've even washed off the marking that I had on here that would show me whether or not it has risen. Okay, so I'm just going to take my starter and I am going to place it in my container. Okay, once you've got it in and you're happy with it, just give it a little shake, exactly the same as before. And then you're going to mark it. So just roughly mark it. Okay, so I'm going to cover it up and then leave it to rise. This will be now left for another 24 hours. So I will see you back in 24 hours. Okay, it's been 24 hours later. You can see a rise in our starter, but you can also see that it has fallen. Right, that just means that it now needs to seriously be fed. Okay, once we feed it, you'll see that it'll rise again. In actual fact, you can tell that it's actually doubled in size, which is a really good sign that our starter is very active. Okay, I have taken photos, which I will also put on here. You'll be able to see properly the amount of bubbles that are in here. That is also an indication that this is very active. The best way to tell whether or not your starter is now ready to actually start baking with is if you take a little bit of it and you actually drop it in the water, okay? Just a normal cup of water, and you pop it in. If your starter sinks like mine did, that just tells you that it's not actually ready yet. Even though we've got great signs that it is very active, that it is on the right track, if it sinks to the bottom of the water, that just means that it's actually not ready yet. Okay, so that is a good way to test. It has only been, I think, about 4 days, which you wouldn't actually get it to rise in that time anyway, to get it to float in that time anyway, even though it is showing really good potential. Okay, so I'm just going to now do my next feed. I think this could be about the 4th feed perhaps. Okay, so same as before, I'm going to measure out 50 grams of starter. At this point, you could probably use the leftover starter that you might have left. If you've used more than the 50 grams like I'm doing, you might be throwing away a lot more starter. And if you are doing that, then what you can do is actually make pancakes with it. Okay, but if you're doing it like I'm doing it, then you can just chuck it out. Okay, I don't have too much left in mine, so I just throw it out. Okay, so same as before, my 50 grams of starter, and then I'm going to add my 30 grams of flour. I'm just going to take a little bit out there. Okay, and then my 20 grams of water. Okay, so now you've got your 50. Okay, so you've started off with 50 grams of starter, and you're going to add another 50 grams of feed, okay? And the feed is a mixture of water and flour. Okay, so I'm going to just mix it all together. And once it's all nicely mixed together, then the same as before, we're going to just place it back into our container and let it rise. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go clean my container. You'll see that mine is fairly thick. If you're not too happy with how thick it's actually going, what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait for my next feed and see whether or not it's still as thick as that. If it is, then I'll probably add just a little bit more water and take out the flour. But if it gets quite runny, then I'm not going to actually add any more water. I'll leave it the way it is. But I'm going to go quickly clean out my container, and then I will carry on putting it in. Okay, back with my clean container, and again washed off the spot that showed me that it had risen. Okay, I'm going to take my starter and I'm going to place it into my container. Okay, mine's landed up on the side, which isn't the best thing. I prefer it to not go on the sides, but obviously with it being a little bit thicker today, it's doing all sorts of things. Sorry, I bumped it there. Okay, so you can see that we've now added it to our container. Just going to shake it out a little bit. Like I said before, it's going to obviously show that it's risen a little bit, but that's purely just because it's now going to settle. But you will be able to tell that your starter is fairly active at this point. It will get to a point now where it's going to start doubling in size all the time, and it should also get to a point where it's going to triple in size, and that's also another indicator to show that it is now ready to bake with. Okay, so we're going to cover it up and we're going to leave it for another 24 hours. Okay, you should be able to bake with it after about a week or so. So we're going to continue to do this until it is ready. Okay, I just need to mark it. Let me grab. Okay, so I'm just going to mark it off. Again, just a little higher than normal, and then we should see it rise. Okay, and I will see you back in 24 hours.